Hello, good afternoon, and welcome to today's lesson. And in today's lesson, we are looking at a very interesting lesson, which is the classification of fatty acids. Classification of fatty acids, that's the topic for today. So, how can we classify fatty acids? That's the question that you have to digest. Well, it is easy to classify fatty acids. Since fatty acids are made up of a carboxyl head and a long chain of carbons, which we call the hydrocarbon, we can just count the number of carbon. There will be fatty acids that will have a long chain, medium chain, and a short chain of carbon within the whole molecules. So using that criteria, we have these three kinds of fatty acids based on that classification. We have what we call a short chain fatty acid, and in a short chain fatty acid they will have a minimum of 2 carbon atoms and a maximum of 4 or 3 in between. That is the range of carbon that you find. Then we also have what we call the medium chain. So in the medium chain you have at least a minimum of 6 carbons and a maximum of 10 carbon atoms. Then we have a longer chain fatty acids. So in this, these are the longest chain that you ever get. So you have a longest chain will have a minimum of 12 carbons and a maximum of what, 26 carbon atoms. So using that, we can classify these fatty acids. But yet another way in which we can classify fatty acid is looking at what we call the level of saturation. So the level of saturation, we're discussing and talking about whether a fatty acid contains a double bond or it does not contain a double bond. So that is what we call by the level of saturation. Some fatty acids will have a double bond, yet some will not have a double bond. So those that without a double bond are the ones that we call saturated fatty acid, meaning they are compacted and they don't have any space. And because of this lack of a double bond, these form other or solid fats which are used in the formation of a cell membrane. So let us look at some of the examples that are used, or the examples of these fatty acids that are saturated. So we have what we call lauric acid. So lauric acid contains a maximum of 12 carbon atoms. Then we also have what we call milistic. So milistic contains a a maximum of 14 carbon atoms. Then we also have what we call palmitic. So palmitic is also a saturated fatty acid which contains 16 carbon atoms. Then we also have stylic. Stylic is also a saturated fatty acid which contains 18 carbon atoms. Then we also have aracidic. Aracidic is also a saturated fatty acid that contains a maximum of 20 carbon atoms. So those are some of the few saturated carbon atoms. Then let us also look at the unsaturated fatty acid. So some of the unsaturated fatty acids, these are fatty acids that contains double bonds. Some fatty acids will have a double bond within the chain. So those that contains a double bond are the ones that we call saturated. So as long as it contains a double bond, then it will termed as a saturated fatty acid. So example of those saturated fatty acids, we have what we call palmitoleic acid, we have oleic acid, we have also linoleic acid. So these three, they are the example of unsaturated fatty acids. So the advantage of these unsaturated fatty acids is because of the double bonds, most of them they have a lower melting point, and because of the double bonds, they easily undergo hydrogenation, which means you're adding hydrogen to a lipid to produce oils or to add in to add in the lipids. So you have like these unsaturated fatty acids, they have a lower melting point, but you can add them to form uh, substances like butter, margarine, using that by the addition of hydrogen, because they have a double bond that can break, and then you can add 2 more hydrogen depending on the number of double bonds that are present within that fatty acid that you're dealing with. Then lastly, the way we classify fatty acid is looking at the base metabolic fat. So the base metabolic fat, what it means in simple terms is whether a fatty acid can be manufactured by the body or it has to be ingested or taken in via the foodstuffs that we eat. So those fatty acids which the body are able to synthesize on their own, that the body are able to make on their own, are the ones that we call non-essential fatty acids. But yet there are those which the body are unable to synthesize or make, are the ones that we call the essential fatty acids. So essential fatty acids, they are the fatty acids that the body needs, but it cannot manufacture on its own unless taken in by the body, taken in via the foodstuffs that we eat. So examples of essential fatty acid, we have what we call linoleic acid, then we have what we call linolenic acid. This is linoleic, then this is linoleic acids. So the other classification is what we call the non-essential, like I discussed. I've mentioned this area on, which is mean the body can manufacture these kinds of fatty acids on its own. So having discussed those few steps, um, let's just do a recap of what we've talked about. So classification of fatty acids is based on three criteria. Number one, looking at the size, where you have the short, medium, and long chain fatty acids. Then you can also classify fatty acids basing on level of saturation, whether they have a double bond or they don't have a double bond. If they have a double bond, then that is called unsaturated. Without a double bond, they are called saturated fatty acid. And lastly is looking at whether the body can manufacture it or it has to be ingested via the foodstuff. If the body can manufacture it, it is non-essential. If the body cannot manufacture it, then it is called essential fatty acids. So with that said, thank you so much for your time and thank you so much for watching. See you in my next lesson. Have a blessed day. Shalom.